A struggling black farmer discovers a dozen mysterious black eggs buried on his land. What hatches from them will not only save his farm, but change his life forever. Before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. The morning sun rose slowly over the rolling hills of Georgia, casting golden light on acres of tired land that had once fed generations. Michael Ray Johnson stood at the edge of his field, the dry wind brushing against his calloused hands. His grandfather had built this farm with hope and sweat. His father had kept it alive with discipline and prayer. But now, under Michael's care, it was barely holding on. For years, Michael had dreamed of running a thriving poultry business, fresh eggs, happy hens, and a small shop bearing his family name, Johnson's Pride Farm. But dreams didn't pay bills, and lately, everything seemed to be falling apart. The feed prices had doubled, the power bills were piling up, and the few customers who still bought his eggs were switching to cheaper brands sold by massive corporations. He walked past the old red barn, its paint long faded, its roof patched with rusted tin sheets. Inside, the familiar scent of hay mixed with the faint odor of oil from the broken tractor he couldn't afford to fix. His chickens clucked lazily, producing fewer eggs with every passing week. Michael bent down, picking up a single brown egg from the straw. He held it gently in his palm, small, ordinary, and barely worth the effort it took to collect. He sighed and whispered, "Grandpa, I'm trying, but I don't know how much longer I can keep this up." The world hadn't been kind to him. Being a black farmer in rural Georgia meant constant judgment, from the banks that refused him loans to the neighboring white landowners who thought his success would make them look bad. He'd spent his life fighting to prove he belonged, that his family's land was worth saving. But sometimes even pride couldn't stop the slow decay of dreams. That afternoon, dark clouds rolled over the valley, promising another storm. Michael hurried to secure the chicken coops, tossing fresh hay and checking the latches. As he worked, something unusual caught his eye near the far edge of the field, a patch of disturbed soil behind an old oak tree. At first, he thought maybe a fox had been digging for food, but as he walked closer, his steps slowed. Nestled in the damp earth was something he'd never seen before, a cluster of eggs, a full dozen of them, perfectly smooth and shining like polished obsidian. They were black, deep, mirror-like black that reflected his face when he leaned closer. He froze. His first thought was snakes, but these eggs were too large, too symmetrical. Chickens? Impossible. None of his hens could have laid anything like this. A strange unease crept over him as the wind rustled through the grass. Michael crouched, touching one of the eggs carefully. It was warm, not hot, not cold, just warm, as if life pulsed inside. "What in the world?" he murmured. For a few long minutes he just stared at them, torn between curiosity and fear. The black shells glistened under the fading daylight, looking almost unnatural, like something born from another world. He remembered the stories his grandmother used to tell, tales of strange omens and signs from the earth, warnings of change or blessings in disguise. He straightened up, wiping the dirt from his jeans. "Well," he muttered, "if you're trouble, you sure picked the wrong farm to mess with." He fetched an old wooden crate from the barn and lined it with hay. Carefully, he lifted each egg, one by one, into the box. They were surprisingly heavy, smooth like glass, and each seemed to hum faintly when he held it. It might have been his imagination, but the feeling made him shiver. Back at the farmhouse, he cleared a space in his small workroom. The incubator, a relic from his father's time, sat on a shelf, dusty but functional. He hadn't used it in years. He plugged it in, adjusted the settings, and placed the black eggs inside with the care of a man handling treasure. That night, he sat by the incubator long after the rain started to fall. Lightning flickered through the window, illuminating the black shells and flashes of silver. He couldn't take his eyes off them. Part of him wanted to call someone, maybe a local vet or biologist, but another part whispered that this was his discovery, his one chance to turn things around. What if these eggs hatched into something rare, something valuable? He imagined the headlines, "Local black farmer discovers mysterious breed of chickens." Maybe people would finally take him seriously. Maybe, just maybe, this was God's way of saying it wasn't over yet. The rain eased, replaced by the steady ticking of the old wall clock. Michael leaned back in his chair, exhaustion washing over him. He whispered a prayer. "Lord, if there's something in them eggs that's meant for me, let it be good. Let it be something that saves this place." He turned off the lamp and glanced one last time at the glowing incubator. The eggs sat motionless, their black shells gleaming in the dark. Michael couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change, though whether for better or worse, he didn't yet know. For a week, the incubator's faint hum became the heartbeat of the farmhouse. Michael woke before dawn, padded across the cool wood floor in wool socks, and leaned over the clear lid as if peering into a secret sky. Inside, the dozen black eggs lay in 2 careful rows on the wire mesh, beads of condensation collecting and sliding down the plastic. He watched the digital readout like a man guarding a sacred flame. Temperature steady, humidity correct, vents half open. He adjusted nothing unless his notebook told him to. Every change was logged, date, hour, dial positions, even the weather outside, because he needed proof that he was doing this right, that he deserved a miracle. By day, he worked the farm. He shoveled out the coops, scrubbed feeders in soapy water until his hands stung, raked the yard beneath the roosts, and patched holes in the fence where foxes had tested the wire. He counted the regular eggs and tried not to wince at the shrinking number. The hens seemed to feel his worry. They clucked softer, moved slower, tilting their heads to examine him with amber eyes, as if they too were waiting for something to change. At night, he returned to the workroom, set a chair by the incubator, and read articles he'd printed in town. Rare breeds, incubation times, failures, successes. The pages smelled like toner and rain. He underlined sentences until the margins looked like fences. More than once, he came across a photograph of Ayam Samani, the so-called Lamborghinis of poultry, black to the bone. He let himself imagine that word wrapping around his life, the way a good coat wraps the shoulders, rare, valuable, saved. Then he would set the papers down and force himself to breathe slowly, reminding his chest not to hope too much at once. The neighbors, of course, noticed the shift in his routine. They always did. A pair of teen boys in a lifted truck idled by the mailbox one afternoon while he unloaded feed. "Hey, Johnson," one called through laughter, "you hatching dragon eggs in there?" The other leaned halfway out the window, eyes bright with mischief. "Careful, they don't bite, man. Might spit fire on that old barn." Michael tipped his cap and kept moving. Ignoring was its own kind of dignity. Still, their laughter hung around after the engine noise faded, like a smell. Later, a woman at the farm supply store shook her head when he paid for a new hygrometer. "Honey," she said, voice sweet as syrup and twice as sticky, "seems to me you'd save more money letting nature do her thing." Her smile was the sort of smile that feels like a closed door. "Sometimes nature needs a hand," he replied gently and carried his bag to the truck. Days gathered into a long, taut thread. He turned the eggs with careful fingers, just a quarter turn at a time, 3 times a day, every day. When the built-in turner clicked to life and tracked its slow arc, he still watched it, palms hovering like a spotter, ready to catch a falling weight. He talked to the eggs under his breath, embarrassed and unembarrassed all at once. "I'm here," he'd say. "I'm keeping you warm. Come on, show me you're in there." The expected hatch window arrived with the same indifferent sunrises as all the days before it. He sat up late, chin in his hand, studying the shadows of the shells for the hairline miracle of a crack. Nothing. He held one to his ear, gently, respectfully, listening for the faint scratch of life. The only sound was his own breath and the small fan inside, whirring like the wings of a moth. He put the egg back, ashamed, as if he had pressed his ear to a stranger's chest. That night, a storm dragged its belly across the valley, grumbling. The farmhouse shook. The barn moaned. Raindrops pitched themselves sideways in gusts and exploded on the windows. Michael checked the breakers twice, terrified of a power flicker. He crouched by the outlet with a flashlight even after the power held, unable to peel himself away from the fear of losing heat at the worst moment. When the storm finally went east, it left a silence that felt too loud. The incubator hummed on. The first ache came 2 mornings later. A pressure behind the eyes, a heaviness under his ribs that turned breathing into work. He chalked it up to lack of sleep. He drank black coffee that tasted like burnt bark and told himself the bitterness would wake him. It didn't. By afternoon, his skin was sweaty and cool at once, and the world came in from the edges like a vignette closing down around a photograph. The incubator readouts blurred, then sharpened when he blinked hard. He kept moving through habit, that old farmer's stubbornness. He changed the waterers, scattered grit, fixed the sagging hinge on the back gate. When a hen pecked his boot and scolded him for standing in the doorway, he laughed, a small, cracked sound, and told her she was the boss. The laugh left his throat hot. He coughed, then coughed again, hands on knees. The ground shifted, a slow, sick ship in heavy seas. That evening, he lay down just to rest the back, and woke hours later to darkness, confused and cold. The clock on the nightstand said 1:12 a.m. His mouth tasted like pennies. A faint light burned under the workroom door, a smudge of glow that told him he had left the lamp on. He swung his feet to the floor, and the floor rose to meet him too fast. For a second, he stood, swaying, then reached the door frame and braced his forearm against it until the room obeyed gravity. In the workroom, the eggs shone like small moons beneath their plastic sky. He placed a hand on the lid, not touching, only measuring the warmth with his skin. It was steady. His fever envied that steadiness. When he tried to write the humidity in the notebook, his pen scratched a wavering number that looked like a child's. He closed the book and sat in the chair. He meant to sit for 5 minutes and listen. He slept until the thin blue of morning. The fever took him in a slow climb like a hill that never ends. He gave up counting the hours. He sweated through his shirt, then through the next, then through the sheets. He dreamed ugly dreams of broken thermometers and lids that would not seal. Once, in the late afternoon, he woke to the sound of rain again and thought it was peeping, that delicate question mark of life, but it was only water from the gutter splashing into the galvanized bucket he'd placed beneath the leak. The disappointment made his bones feel hollow. With Michael down, the farm revealed how much of its order had lived inside his routines. Weeds quickened in the kitchen garden, vaulting over the brick border as if jumping a low fence. The coop smelled stronger, straw clumped in damp corners. A sack of feed he had meant to move stayed by the barn door, growing a dark mouth where mice had chewed at night. The mailbox, filled with flyers he had no energy to throw away. Pastures yellowed at the edges. The hens pecked half-heartedly in the dust. The world did not fall apart in a dramatic rush. It sagged, a little more each day, the way a porch step gives under 100 small feet. On the third day of fever, he tried to call the clinic in town, but his voice failed him before the receptionist finished her greeting. He set the phone down and leaned his forehead against the cool window glass, fogging it. The oak tree beyond the yard stood with its arms upraised, unbothered. He remembered his father saying, "Trees don't hurry, son. They hold on." "Hold on," he whispered to the eggs across the house. "Hold on for me." The next morning, an old Ford slowed in front of his drive. Through the haze, Michael registered a face at the wheel, familiar, concerned, and a hand lifted in a quick wave that was more question than greeting. He wanted to step onto the porch and say, "I'm all right," but his legs argued. By the time he made it to the screen door, the truck had rolled on, tires hissing over wet gravel. He let the door close without opening it, lay back down, and slept asleep without edges. Time shrank to a corridor between his bed and the incubator. He walked it like a pilgrim in a small cathedral, one hand on the wall. The workroom had become something holy in its plainness. A scarred table, mason jars of screws and nails, the smell of cedar shavings from an old bag he had opened to remind himself of the forest. The incubator's fan sang its thin note. He lifted the lid only when he had to, and only for seconds. He refilled the wells with warm water, steam rising like breath in winter. He turned the eggs, careful not to jostle, palms trembling a little. Then he closed the lid and waited for the numbers on the display to climb home again. At the edge of the recommended hatch window's end, his hope thinned to a wire, but it did not snap. It simply hummed at a pitch that hurt. He set one egg on the candler and watched the shadows move in their familiar, unreadable patterns. Was that a vein? A trick of light? He turned the egg a fraction, the shadow shifted as if answering and then refused to answer. He put it back, ashamed again of asking so much from a silent thing. Outside, the town carried on. Children waited for the bus at the corner in bright backpacks, and the driver laced his fingers over the wheel. A dog barked at nothing or at everything. A church sign 2 miles away traded out one scripture for another. Somewhere, someone laughed over a plate of diner pancakes, the kind that come with butter already melting like snow. All of it seemed to occur on the far side of a thick pane of glass, and all of it happened without him, which is a particular kind of loneliness. When he could not sleep, he spoke aloud to his grandfather as he had on the first day, not because he believed the dead could change humidity, but because he needed to say his fear into a room that would not argue or pity him. "I'm doing it the way you taught me," he murmured. "I'm keeping watch. I ain't quit. If there's life in there, I'm here to meet it. If there ain't, I'll still be here tomorrow. I'll still feed what's mine to feed." Saying it made the promise real, and promises are a kind of medicine. On the 7th night, the fever broke like a storm that runs out of rain. He woke, chilled, the sheets a damp rope around his waist, and for the first time in days his thoughts lined up like fence posts instead of skittering like mice. He showered, shaved clumsily, ate 2 slices of toast with honey, and drank tea. His hands stopped shaking. When he walked the corridor to the workroom, the floorboards didn't tilt. The incubator shone softly in the morning light that had just managed to find the window. He lifted the notebook and wrote neatly. Fever easing, levels stable, window nearly closed. He did not add a sentence about hope or despair. He did not need to. Both lived on his face, and the eggs, if they were listening, already knew. He pulled the chair closer and sat. Outside, another storm gathered on the horizon, the kind that smells like iron and delivers only heat lightning. The air in the room was warm and damp and steady. He laced his fingers together, rested his chin on his knuckles, and fixed his eyes on the dozen black shells. He told himself he could wait one more hour, one more day, one more as long as it took. Somewhere in the house, a wall clock ticked toward a future he could not see. The incubator hummed, patient as breath, and Michael Ray Johnson, still weak but unbroken, kept watch, not knowing that the next sound to break the silence would change everything. The morning broke heavy with mist, the kind that softened every sound and made the world feel as if it were holding its breath. Michael Ray Johnson sat at his small kitchen table, the steam from his coffee curling into the gray air when he heard it, faint, distant, and uncertain. A sound so delicate that for a moment he thought it was just the wind brushing against the window. But then it came again. Peep. He froze. The mug trembled in his hands. For days he had prayed for that sound, dreamed it, imagined it in feverish delirium, and now it was here, real and trembling, like the whisper of life itself. He pushed back his chair and limped toward the workroom. His fever had left him weak, but his heart pounded with renewed strength. Each step echoed louder than the last. As he reached the incubator, his breath caught. One of the eggs moved. Not much, just a twitch, but enough to make his pulse race. "Come on, little one," he whispered, his voice cracking. The black shell quivered again, a hairline fracture tracing its surface like lightning across a night sky. Then another, and another. The cracking multiplied, soft and steady, as if the earth itself were waking up inside that small chamber. He stumbled back to the kitchen, grabbed his phone, and with shaken fingers called his old friend and neighbor. "Jordan," he said breathlessly, "you need to get here, now." By the time Jordan arrived, the workroom was filled with tiny sounds, faint peeping, tapping, and the gentle hiss of the incubator. The two men stood side by side in silence, watching as life forced its way through the darkness. The first chick emerged slowly, drenched and trembling, its feathers already showing a strange sheen. It was black. Not brown, not gray, black as midnight, as if it had been painted by shadow itself. Michael leaned closer, tears welling in his eyes. "Lord, have mercy," he whispered. "It's beautiful." Jordan laughed softly. "Man, I don't even know what kind of bird that is, but you just found yourself something special." One after another, the remaining eggs began to crack. The room filled with sound, faint chirps, tiny gasps of new life. Within an hour, 12 small creatures stood wobbling on their thin legs, covered in feathers so dark they shimmered blue under the light. They pecked at the straw, curious and fearless. Michael couldn't look away. For months, his world had been empty. Days filled with debt, exhaustion, and loneliness. But now, before his eyes, the impossible had happened. His farm, his hope, his future, they all breathed again in the form of 12 black chicks. Jordan wiped his forehead, laughing in disbelief. "You realize people are going to go crazy when they see these, right?" "Crazy?" Michael repeated, blinking through tears. "You mean blessed?" Jordan pulled out his phone and started recording. "Whatever you call it, I'm posting this online. Folks won't believe it unless they see it." By nightfall, the video was everywhere. It spread through the small Georgia town first, then beyond, to farming groups, news blogs, and social media pages filled with wonder and curiosity. "Black miracle chicks found on struggling farm," one headline read. Within 2 days, journalists started calling. They wanted interviews, photos, explanations. Michael didn't know what to say. He wasn't a scientist. He was just a man trying to survive. But when he looked at those chicks, sleek, shimmering, full of energy, he knew this was something the world had never seen before. Still, he was cautious. "Let's not rush to show 'em off," he told Jordan. "They're still fragile. Gotta make sure they're healthy first." Together, they built a warm enclosure in the barn, lining it with straw and fitting heat lamps. Michael checked the chicks every few hours, gently talking to them as if they were children. He noted everything: how much they ate, how fast they grew, how they seemed smarter and more active than any bird he'd ever raised. But as night fell again, a thought nagged at him. What if these creatures weren't just rare? What if they weren't supposed to exist here at all? He picked up one of the eggshells left behind, rolling it between his fingers. It gleamed faintly, reflecting his face in its curved surface. He could see the exhaustion in his eyes, and behind it, something else. Fear. "God," he murmured, "what did I bring into this world?" Jordan clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Whatever they are, Mike, they're yours. And maybe they're what's going to save this place." Michael nodded slowly. Deep down, he wanted to believe that. But as the wind howled outside and the chicks huddled close under the lamps, he couldn't shake the sense that something larger was unfolding. Something far beyond his understanding. For now, though, he chose hope. He locked the barn door, took one last look at the glowing enclosure, and whispered to the chicks, "Rest easy, little miracles. You made it through the dark." He didn't know it yet, but those tiny birds, those strange black creatures born from the soil of his land, would soon change not only his life, but the entire town's fate. The first reporter arrived with the fog, tires crunching the gravel like someone eating ice in a quiet room. Michael was in the barn, checking the heat lamps and the feeders, when a soft knock framed itself in the open doorway. A woman in a denim jacket lifted her press badge between two fingers and smiled like she'd planned the smile on the drive over. "Mr. Johnson, I'm Kayla from the Valley Ledger. Folks say you've got something special in here." Michael glanced at the brooder, where 12 cold dark bodies trembled with small importance. He tugged the brim of his cap down and nodded. "They're alive and doing fine. That's all that matters right now." Kayla kept a respectful distance, notebook ready. "Mind if I ask a few questions? Not long. Just enough to tell folks what's happening out here." He hesitated, looking from the reporter to the chicks. All his instincts said, "Protect them. Protect this." But another voice, thin, hopeful, reminded him what a little light can do for a field grown used to shadow. "All right," he said finally. 5 minutes. 5 turned into 15. Photographs turned into a short video. By afternoon, the Ledger's blog had posted a piece with a headline that felt like a blessing and a dare. "Black chicks on a black farmer's lot. Miracle at Johnson's Pride." Comments bloomed in the margins like wildflowers. By evening, 2 more reporters arrived. By morning, a news van. Michael tried to keep order against the sudden swell. He set a rope line outside the barn and made a hand-lettered sign, "Quiet for the babies." Jordan acted as informal gatekeeper, pointing out where folks could stand and where they could not, cracking jokes to soften the push and pull of curiosity. Most people behaved. They took their pictures, asked soft questions, and left with little gasps of wonder folded into their goodbyes. Mid-morning on the second day, a man in a dark blazer and clean boots stepped from a rental SUV and studied the barn as if he were measuring it for a suit. He introduced himself with a firm handshake and a card that named him in raised silver letters, Elliot Harris, Heritage and Rare Breeds, Investments and Advisory. "I've read the local coverage," he said, eyes flicking to the brooder, then back to Michael's face. "I also received 3 photographs and a short clip from a colleague who knows I have interests. Mr. Johnson, with your permission, may I take a closer look?" Michael didn't answer right away. He'd met men with cards like that, or at least men who carried themselves like doors to a room he rarely got invited into. Some of them talked soft and left rough. Still, there was no greed in Harris's gaze, only a careful alertness, the sort of attention a craftsman pays to grain in cut wood. "You step where I step," Michael said at last, raising the rope and guiding him inside. The enclosure hummed with heat. Under the lamps, the chicks were a lake of moving shadow. Harris crouched, one hand pressed lightly to the outside of the brooder wall as if feeling for a heartbeat. After a still minute, he exhaled, not with surprise but recognition. "Ayam Samani," he said. The words landed like a key turning in a familiar lock. Indonesian origin, fibromelanosis gene, hyperpigmentation, black skin, black feathers, black bones, known for a green-blue iridescence in good light. He tipped his head, pleased to find exactly that sheen sliding over the chick's shoulders when one pivoted. They're rare, even where they're known. Here, they're almost myth. Michael swallowed. The name felt like a tide rising around his ankles. "So, I'm not dreaming?" "Not unless I am too." Harris stood, dusted his knee. "They appear vigorous. Good weight, clear eyes, clean vents. If they're from healthy stock, you've got something extraordinary. As living creatures first, and as a potential business second." "Second," Michael echoed, more to himself than to the man. Harris's gaze softened. "Second," he affirmed, "but let's not pretend the second doesn't matter. You've been given a door. If you want, I can help you decide how wide to open it." He spoke plainly, sketching possibilities without pressing. Veterinary oversight to certify health, controlled breeding to maintain traits, a pre-order list for hatching eggs, farm tours by appointment, limited to protect the birds. "You keep control," he said. "I advise, invest, and take a minority cut. No change to your land title, no games with your name. Your farm stays your farm." The offer hung in the barn like dry cloth catching a breeze. Michael felt its shape, imagined it sewn into a coat that might fit for years. He didn't say yes. He didn't say no. "I don't sign nothing while the ink's still wet in my head," he said gently, "but I hear you." "Good," Harris replied. "We can take it at your pace." He paused, then added, almost as an aside, "For what it's worth, Mr. Johnson, you've done right by them. People cut corners. You didn't." The compliment reached a place under Michael's ribs that had been cold for a long time. He nodded once, unable to carry more words without spilling them. The crowd outside shifted. A new vehicle pushed up the lane, mud jumping from its tires in wet applause. Even before the door opened, Jordan muttered, "Aw, hell," and Michael felt the barn drop 5 degrees. The man who climbed out wore money like a second skin. Cream hat, pressed shirt, silver belt buckle big as a saucer. Crawford was written across his jawline, not in letters, but in the set of the bone. A local landowner who'd made a sport of reminding smaller farmers how small they were. "Johnson," he called, not bothering with hello. "We need to talk." Michael stepped through the rope to meet him halfway, body angling so the barn door stayed between Crawford and the brooder. "Mornin'," he said, voice even. "What can I do for you?" "What you can do," Crawford said, smiling without his eyes, "is return what's mine." The sentence arranged a hush around itself. A few townsfolk traded glances. The newswoman raised her chin, sensing story. Michael's mouth went dry. "Say again?" "Those eggs," Crawford said, flicking his hat brim toward the barn. They didn't come from your flock, they came from mine. Rare imports, cost me more than your granddaddy paid for that land. Some no-count hands must have dropped 'em on your property to avoid getting caught. Doesn't matter how they got there, the right thing is the right thing. Give 'em back." Jordan made a small sound in his throat, half laugh, half warning. Michael lifted a palm to quiet him. "Mr. Crawford," he said carefully, "I found a dozen eggs on my land. No marks, no crates, no claims. I did what a farmer does. I kept them safe and warm. They hatched here. As far as the law and the Lord, that's enough." Crawford's smile thinned. "Law and Lord, that's pretty, but the world doesn't work on pretty. It works on proof. And I got proof. Papers from my shipment. The only ayam whatever within 3 counties. You think a man like you just lucks into something like that?" He leaned closer. His voice cooled. "Don't make this ugly." The words landed where Crawford meant them to. Michael felt heat climb his neck, a flash of old humiliations. Loan officers who called him Mike without permission, a fair judge who weighed his eggs with a fingertip on the scale, a deputy who pulled him over twice in 1 week to check the light. The past pressed its thumb into the day. "Sir," Harris said, stepping forward with a politeness that made room for steel, "I'm an investor in rare breeds. If you have import documentation, we can review it. Quietly, properly. But claims without chain of custody don't trump possession, particularly with animals already hatched under someone else's care." Crawford looked him up and down, recalculating. "And you are?" "Someone who reads the fine print." Harris kept his voice mild. "And someone who knows that accusing a man in public without evidence could be considered defamation. Mr. Johnson is willing to listen. Are you willing to show?" "I don't show to strangers," Crawford snapped. "Then show to the sheriff," Kayla said from behind her notebook, expression neutral as a mirror. "He's already on his way, Mr. Crawford. Public interest story. He tends to be curious." Something flickered in Crawford's eyes. Not fear, exactly, but annoyance at a script going off book. He pulled his hat lower, as if it could shade the shape of his temper. "Fine," he said, "we'll do it formal. But hear me, Johnson. What's yours and what you wish was yours are 2 different things. Don't get confused." Michael held his gaze. He refused to shrink his voice. "I'm not confused," he said. "I know what hatched in my care. I know what I've watched every hour, every night. I know what I've fed and warmed and protected. That's not confusion, that's stewardship." The word hung in the air, a quiet bell. Crawford stared another beat, then turned hard on his heel. Gravel spat from under his boots. The truck door slammed like a period. The crowd exhaled. Jordan let out a breath he'd been hoarding. Kayla lowered her pen and shook her wrist. Harris, beside Michael, said softly, "You handled that." "I handled it for now." Michael unclenched his hands, surprised to find crescent moons pressed into his palms by his own nails. His chest was bright with a tired anger, but under it was something older and steadier, the simple knowledge of right work done right. The sheriff did come, broad hat, slow stride, open hands. He asked even questions, took even notes, nodded even nods. Crawford returned with a folder of shipment papers that proved he had, indeed, paid for imported birds, but those papers proved nothing about the dozen eggs laid in dirt under Michael's oak tree. No missing property report, no marks on shells, no witnesses to a transfer. The law did what the law sometimes does when no one had thought to write down a moment while it happened. It refused to time travel. "Civil matter, if you want to make it one," the sheriff said in the balanced tone of a man standing between 2 barns in a dry lightning storm. "But, as of now, The birds belonged to the man keeping them alive. Crawford's jaw did a small, ugly dance. He left without another speech. The road swallowed him, and the day opened again like a shutter letting in light. In the quiet that followed, Michael went back to the brooder. The chicks were sleeping in one soft, irregular heap, their beaks tucked, their breathing small and honest. He rested his hand on the plywood edge. The wood held the warmth of the lamps and his work. He felt, with a clarity that made his vision sting, exactly what was in the room. Heat, life, promise, and also labor, vigilance, boundary. Harris stood a pace behind. "My offer stands," he said, tone gentler now. "Not just the money, structure, protection. You'll have people like Mr. Crawford at your fence for a while. Success draws shadows. Let me help you hang lights." Michael thought of rope lines and handwritten signs, of his grandfather's hand showing him how to turn an egg with 2 fingers and a prayer. He thought of the neighbors who had come with casseroles during his fever and left them on the porch without asking for anything back. He thought of the word he'd spoken out loud, stewardship, and how it felt to hear it ring true. "All right," he said slowly, tasting each syllable for truth. "We'll talk. On my porch. With coffee. You'll tell me what you get, I'll tell you what I keep, and we'll write it plain." Harris smiled, not a conqueror's smile, but a craftsman's, recognizing another person who cared about edges lining up. Plain it is. That evening, as the sun tipped the fields with copper and the last of the reporters packed their gear, Michael sat alone on the step between the barn and the yard. The day's noise dissolved into crickets. The oak lifted its black lace against a violet sky. Inside the barn, the chicks murmured in their sleep, an ocean of tiny tides turning under a heat moon. He let the quiet settle into him. The confrontation had rattled the old rafters of his heart, and yet nothing that mattered had fallen. The birds were still here. The work would still be waiting at dawn. The world had seen him, some to scoff, some to help, and he had stood his ground without shouting. That felt like a kind of harvest, not the kind you stack in baskets, but the kind you carry in your chest. When he rose to go in, he paused at the brooder. One chick near the corner shifted and turned an eye toward him, glossy and dark as a seed. It blinked once, twice. Michael chuckled under his breath. "We're all right," he told it. "We're still here." He switched off the aisle light, left the red lamps glowing, and closed the barn door with the care of a father easing a nursery shut. The latch clicked, a small, satisfied sound. On the porch, a folder rested on the table, Harris's draft, clean and simple, waiting for morning coffee and a steady hand. The night gathered. The farm breathed. And far beyond the fence line, men who followed money and men who followed miracles both turned in their sleep, not knowing that on a little patch of Georgia earth a door had opened, and a man had decided how wide it would swing. Dawn broke soft and golden across Johnson's Pride Farm. Dew beaded on the fence rails like quiet applause, and the air smelled of hay, damp soil, and promise. Michael Ray Johnson stood outside the barn, his coffee untouched in one hand, watching the thin curl of mist rise over the valley. The world looked calmer now, but inside him was a storm of awe. A week had passed since the confrontation with Crawford. The sheriff's verdict had settled the matter, the reporters had moved on, and the farm had slipped back into a gentler rhythm. Yet something deeper had changed. There was a hum beneath everything, the hum of attention. People weren't just curious now, they were invested. Orders came in from out of state. A university sent a researcher to collect samples. Even children stopped by with wide eyes, pressing their faces to the fence to see the legendary shadow chickens. Michael moved through the barn with deliberate grace. The 12 Ayam Cemani chicks had grown astonishingly fast, feathers thickening, bodies strengthening. Their color had deepened from black to a glossy oil-slick shimmer, green and purple chasing each other across every movement. They were not just birds, they were alive in a way that made the air vibrate around them. He checked their feed, refilled the water, and wrote notes in his logbook. Excellent weight. No disease signs. Alert and responsive. Each word steadied him. The numbers, the routine, they kept him grounded in work instead of wonder. But that morning, something tugged at his attention. One chick, slightly apart from the rest, lifted its head and met his eyes. Its feathers gleamed with the same iridescent light as the others, but its gaze was different, sharper, almost knowing. When it turned towards the sunbeam leaking through the slats, Michael saw what set it apart. Its eyes were blue, not gray, not dark, blue. He leaned closer, heart thudding. "Now, what on earth are you, little one?" He called Jordan, who hurried over, still wiping breakfast crumbs from his beard. Together, they stared at the tiny creature like two men who'd seen fire for the first time. "Man," Jordan whispered, "that ain't just rare. That's something else entirely." By noon, Harris was back, summoned by a shaky phone call. The investor crouched beside the brooder again, peering through the wire. His face, always composed, showed honest wonder. "Blue-eyed Ayam Cemani," he murmured. "Never documented before. Not in Indonesia, not anywhere." He took photographs, feathers, and a few quiet measurements. The chick barely blinked. "It's a mutation," Harris said finally, "but not a flaw, an advancement. A genetic variation that enhances pigmentation and growth rate. This bird is a miracle within a miracle." The phrase hung in the barn like incense. Michael swallowed hard. "So what you're telling me is—" "I'm telling you," Harris interrupted gently, "that your farm now holds the most valuable living specimen of this breed in the world." For a long time, neither man spoke. Outside, the hens clucked, and the wind shifted through the oak leaves, carrying the faint perfume of pine from the hills. Michael's knees went weak, and he sank onto a bale of straw. He laughed once, the sound breaking halfway through and turning into a sob. "I've been fighting to keep this place alive," he said hoarsely, "and all along, life was waiting right under my feet." Harris rested a hand on his shoulder. "You earned it, Mr. Johnson. Fate might drop the seed, but only a man who tends the soil gets to see it bloom." By that evening, the news spread again. This time, not through rumor, but through official word from the Agricultural Department and university labs. Johnson's miracle chick made headlines. Reporters described the blue-eyed bird as a once-in-history discovery, and within days, international organizations contacted Harris and Michael about partnerships, licensing, and preservation. For the first time in years, checks arrived faster than bills. Michael rebuilt the fence, repaired the barn roof, and replaced his old tractor. Not with a shiny new one, but with a reliable machine painted the same deep black as his birds. He hired local help, giving jobs to those who had once doubted him. His farm became a place not just of work, but of pride, a gathering point where school children learned that miracles sometimes wore feathers. Months later, when the breeding program officially launched, Michael invited everyone who'd stood by him, Jordan, Kayla, the sheriff, even Harris. They ate under the oak tree where it had all begun. The brooder stood nearby, open and empty, its warmth replaced by sunlight and laughter. After dinner, Harris lifted a glass of sweet tea. "To the man who proved that faith, patience and good hands can turn mystery into legacy," he said. Michael smiled, eyes glistening. "To the land," he replied quietly, raising his own glass, "and to every dark thing that still carries light inside." As dusk settled over the valley, the blue-eyed chick, now nearly grown, perched on the fence post, feathers catching the last of the sun. Michael watched it for a long time. Its gaze was steady, calm, unafraid. He thought of his grandfather, of storms survived, of nights spent praying beside the incubator. He thought of every no he'd ever heard and how one silent yes from fate had rewritten them all. "Maybe God gave me black eggs," he murmured, "to remind me that miracles can hatch from the darkest shells." The sky dimmed to indigo. Crickets began their low chorus. In the barn, the other birds settled for the night, their quiet breathing folding into the rhythm of the farm. And as the first stars pierced the horizon, Michael Ray Johnson stood in the doorway of his rebuilt barn, no longer the man who waited for luck, but the man who proved that patience, faith, and hard work could turn even darkness into life. Sometimes, miracles hatch from the darkest places. What did you think of Michael's story? Tell us in the comments. And remember to like, subscribe, and share this video to support more inspiring stories like this one. See you in the next episode.